Modern AI works because a machine can learn from examples instead of just obeying rules. That idea was on the table decades ago. Then the institutions funding artificial intelligence lost their nerve, pulled back, and helped steer the field away from the path that now powers everything from chatbots to image generators. They were wrong. They were wrong. This is the story of how AI almost got detoured. What that tells you about what AI really is. This is the story of how long a correct idea can be buried. Frank Rosenblatt proposed that machines could learn from examples instead of following rules, built a working version in 1958, and watched his own field call it a dead end just 11 years later. On the 7th of July 1958, the United States Office of Naval Research convened a press conference in Washington, D.C., with a singular purpose: to introduce the world to a machine that could teach itself. The announcement centered on a concept then being simulated on a 5-ton IBM 704 computer at Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo, New York. They called it the Perceptron. Standing before the assembled press was a 29-year-old psychologist from Cornell University named Frank Rosenblatt. Born on the 11th of July, 1928, in New Rochelle, New York, he would turn 30 in 4 days' time. His claims that morning were extraordinary. He described his creation as the first machine capable of having an original idea, a statement whose ambition would follow him for the rest of his life. The New York Times ran with it. Their headline declared, "New Navy device learns by doing. Psychologist shows embryo of computer designed to read and grow wiser." The paper reported that the Navy expected the machine would eventually be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its own existence. The New Yorker went further still, calling the Perceptron the first serious rival to the human brain. What gave those claims their peculiar weight was not mere showmanship. Unlike every computing machine that had come before it, the Perceptron was not handed a set of rules and told to follow them. It adjusted its own internal connections through trial and error, modifying itself each time it encountered a mistake. In that room of journalists and naval officers, a genuinely new kind of machine had been introduced to the world. In 1943, a neurophysiologist and a mathematician asked what, precisely, a nerve cell actually does. Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts reduced the neuron to its starkest abstraction, a unit that either fires or does not, a biological on-off switch. Their paper, A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity, proved that networks of such units could, in principle, compute any logical function the mind could conceive. 6 years on, Donald Hebb offered something McCulloch and Pitts had deliberately set aside, a count of change over time. Canadian psychologist's 1949 book, Organization of Behavior, proposed that when two neurons repeatedly fire together, the synapse connecting them grows stronger. Summarized later as neurons that fire together, wire together, it was the first credible biological explanation for how lived experience could physically reshape neural tissue. Frank Rosenblatt had come up through the Bronx High School of Science, that fiercely competitive incubator of New York scientific talent. Graduating in 1946, he went on to Cornell University in Ithaca, completing his undergraduate degree in 1950 and his doctorate in 1956. Trained first and last as a psychologist, his deepest preoccupation was how the brain encodes and retrieves patterns from experience. By the middle of the 1950s, Rosenblatt had arrived at Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo, a research facility entirely separate from the Ithaca campus. He brought a conviction. Theories of the mind remained speculation unless tested in hardware. McCulloch and Pitts had shown that neurons could compute, and Hebb had supplied the mechanism by which connections might strengthen through use. What no one had yet built was a machine that demonstrated it. The first Perceptron had no body. In 1957, Rosenblatt translated his theory into code, ran it on an IBM 704 at Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory. Each trial was simple. The machine classified a pattern, learned whether it was wrong, and then adjusted its internal numerical weights. The weights connected to the incorrect answer were weakened, while strengthened connections reinforced whatever had pointed toward the truth. The machine, in effect, was correcting itself. This was not mere trial and error. Rosenblatt recognized that what he had built was a mathematical analog of Hebbian learning, the biological principle that neurons which fire together wire together. He then proved what became the Perceptron convergence theorem. If a dataset was linearly separable, meaning a flat boundary existed that could divide all its categories cleanly, the algorithm was guaranteed to find correct weights in a finite number of steps. The guarantee was absolute. What followed was hardware. Between 1959 and 1960, Rosenblatt's team at Cornell constructed the Mark I Perceptron. Its input layer was a grid of 400 photocells arranged 20 by 20. Behind them sat 512 association units, and 8 output units completed the chain. Crucially, connections between layers were adjusted not by software, but by electric motors, physically turning potentiometers, shifting resistance values during every training pass. June 23, 1960, the Mark I had its first public demonstration. Navy funding had underwritten the effort, a $10,000 contract from the Institute for Defense Analysis in 1959, later supplemented by $153,000 from the Office of Naval Research. 2 years on, Rosenblatt published Principles of Neurodynamics, Perceptrons, and the Theory of Brain Mechanisms, a 616-page formal treatment from Spartan books that would stand as the field's definitive mathematical account. Marvin Minsky walked the corridors of the Bronx High School of Science 2 years before Frank Rosenblatt arrived. Minsky graduated in 1944, Rosenblatt in 1946. They never overlapped directly, but both were shaped by the same ferociously competitive intellectual culture, a school that prided itself on producing minds built to argue. That common formation left permanent marks on both of them. Minsky settled at MIT, where he co-founded the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and his conviction was absolute: the mind is a symbol processor. In 1956, he helped organize a landmark summer conference at Dartmouth College, alongside John McCarthy, Claude Shannon, and Nathaniel Rochester. That gathering gave the field its name. Rosenblatt was not present. The connectionist approach he was quietly developing stood entirely outside the emerging consensus. The divide was not merely technical. Minsky's symbolic camp held that brains were logical inference engines, that learning from raw data was a dead end. Rosenblatt believed the opposite. Structure would emerge from sufficient exposure to examples without anyone specifying it in advance. At conferences throughout the 1960s, they debated publicly. Colleagues described those exchanges as extraordinary. Two men from the same Bronx streets who now represented irreconcilable visions of the mind. In 1969, the Association for Computing Machinery awarded Minsky its Turing Award, the highest honor computing could confer, recognizing his contributions to symbolic AI. It was the apex of his standing in the field and the clearest signal of which vision had prevailed. That same year, the most consequential written attack on Rosenblatt's ideas went to print, bearing Minsky's name. The timing carried its own message. In 1969, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert published Perceptrons, an introduction to computational geometry through MIT Press. The book was technically meticulous. Its central proof was precise. A single-layer perceptron cannot compute the exclusive or function. XOR requires a nonlinear boundary between two classes, and a truth table makes the problem vivid. 2 inputs, 4 possible combinations, and no single straight line that separates them correctly. They went further than XOR. For certain predicates, including the question of whether regions in an image are physically connected, the number of connections a single-layer network requires grows faster than the size of its input. On a blackboard, thick with formal notation, this result was legitimate and important science. Those tasks become computationally intractable as images scale up. Nobody argued with their algebra. The fatal step arrived without fanfare. Minsky and Papert conjectured that similar limitations would apply to multilayer perceptrons as well, but offered no mathematical proof to support it. The conjecture sat alongside their rigorous theorems, and most readers saw no distinction between the two. What had been demonstrated about a single layer was absorbed by the field as a judgment about every layer. Federal funding for neural network research collapsed almost immediately. Program managers and grant committees received the book as a kind of formal verdict, and the term neural networks began to repel funding rather than attract it. Entire research programs dissolved. A generation of scientists moved toward problems that carried no institutional hazard. Charts of grant approvals told the story in a single, sustained descent. Enough. After 1969, Rosenblatt never published a direct mathematical answer to perceptrons. The momentum in the field had already shifted irrevocably. Funding dried up, conference programs moved on, and the scientists who might have defended his work were scattered. The most urgent battles, as far as the institutions were concerned, had moved elsewhere. There was no constituency left for a rebuttal that nobody in power wished to hear. Rosenblatt had already begun migrating his attention toward biology. By 1966, he had joined Cornell's newly formed Division of Biological Sciences, taking a position in the section of neurobiology and behavior. By 1971, he was acting chair of that section. Inside his laboratory, he pursued a deeply controversial line of inquiry, attempting to demonstrate that memory could be chemically encoded in RNA and transferred between rats through injection. RNA memory experiments were contested almost immediately and never been replicated. Yet they revealed something consistent about Rosenblatt's character. His former student, George Nagy, who completed his doctorate at Cornell in 1962 and later became a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic, remembered a man who would, in his words, reach out and grasp the biggest problems. Ambition had always outrun the available technology. That gap was, perhaps, the defining tragedy of his career. 2 years earlier, Marvin Minsky had received the Turing Award, the highest honor in computing. Neural network research was entering what historians would later call its first winter, and Rosenblatt, who had received no major disciplinary honors, took his sloop, the Shearwater, out onto the Chesapeake Bay. On the 11th of July, 1971, his 43rd birthday, he drowned. No rebuttal, no vindication, only the water and the silence that followed. In 1973, the British government commissioned the mathematician James Lighthill to assess the state of artificial intelligence research. His report was damning. The field, Lighthill concluded, had overpromised and underdelivered and faced an insurmountable barrier he called combinatorial explosion. When the variables in any real-world problem multiplied, the required computation grew beyond reach. Government accepted his findings and cut AI funding sharply across British universities. Across the Atlantic, the same verdict was taking institutional form. In 1974, DARPA redirected its support away from basic AI research toward projects with demonstrable military utility. Neural network research, already philosophically discredited by Minsky and Papert, was now financially unviable. Through most of the 1970s, the handful of researchers who still believed in the approach worked in the margins, in smaller programs far outside the mainstream. That same year, a graduate student at Harvard named Paul Werbos quietly published something of extraordinary consequence. Buried in his doctoral thesis, titled Beyond Regression, New Tools for Prediction and Analysis in the Behavioral Sciences, was a working description of backpropagation, the algorithm that would eventually solve the problem of training multilayer networks. Almost no one in the field noticed. The thesis sat on library shelves, largely unread, for a decade. The silence began to crack in 1982, and the break came not from computer science, but from physics. John Hopfield of Caltech published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences demonstrating a recurrent neural network capable of something remarkable, associative memory retrieval. If the network stored a pattern, it could reconstruct the whole from a partial fragment. The paper drew physicists into a conversation that computer scientists had abandoned. Geoffrey Hinton was one of the few who had never left. Late 1970s and into the early 1980s, working first at Carnegie Mellon and later at the University of Toronto, Hinton continued building multi-layer neural networks. When doing so, carried genuine professional risk. The consensus Minsky and Papert had forged was so thoroughly absorbed by funding agencies that their conclusions were treated not as contested theory, but as established fact. In October 1986, David Rumelard, Geoffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams published Learning Representations by Backpropagating Errors in Nature, Volume 323. Their method demonstrated that multi-layer networks could be trained by sending error signals backward through every layer, adjusting each weight in turn. The conjecture Minsky and Papert had built into a mathematical monument was, at last, directly refuted. By the mid-1980s, the conjecture had been proved definitively wrong. Multilayer networks could learn the very functions Minsky and Papert had implied were intractable. In 1988, the authors published an expanded edition, adding a prologue and epilogue that addressed the neural network revival directly. The new edition contained no fresh scientific results. That silence, alongside its existence, was acknowledgement and did. By 2006, Hinton and his collaborators had published 2 more papers that reignited the field. Working with Seymour and Yiwei Tehe, he showed in neural computation that very deep networks could be trained successfully, layer by layer. A companion paper with Ruslan Salakudinov, published in Science, demonstrated that such architectures could dramatically compress and reconstruct complex data. The moment that ended the debate arrived in 2012. Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and Geoffrey Hinton entered a neural network called AlexNet into the ImageNet large-scale visual recognition challenge. Their top 5 error rate was 15.3%, more than 10 percentage points below the nearest competitor. A gap that size does not merely win a competition, it makes every other approach obsolete. In 2018, the Association for Computing Machinery awarded the Turing Award to Geoffrey Hinton, Jan LeCun, and Joshua Bengio, citing conceptual and engineering breakthroughs that had made deep neural networks a critical component of computing. The field that Minsky and Papert had declared a dead end now commanded the highest honor in computer science. Then, in October 2024, John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton received the Nobel Prize in Physics for foundational discoveries and inventions enabling machine learning with artificial neural networks. It was the first Nobel awarded in the tradition Rosenblatt had begun. The perceptron is the fundamental unit underlying modern deep learning, from large language models to protein folding predictors, and each depends on the backpropagation rule that Rosenblatt's architecture made possible. In 2004, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers established the Frank Rosenblatt Award, granted for outstanding contributions to biologically and linguistically motivated computational paradigms. The field had spent decades treating his work as a cautionary tale. Now it was naming its highest honor in that domain for him. John Hopfield received the award in 2009, 15 years before his neural network research earned the Nobel Prize in Physics. By 2019, Cornell University itself had begun to reckon with the gap between what Rosenblatt had achieved and how the discipline had treated him. The Cornell Chronicle published a retrospective bearing the headline, "Professor's Perceptron paved the way for artificial intelligence 60 years too soon." Thorsten Joachims, a Cornell professor, told the publication that the foundations for all of this artificial intelligence had been laid there. The Minsky and Papert critique had contained valid mathematics. Within the narrow confines of single-layer perceptrons, their proofs held. But the conjecture that extended those findings to all future architectures was unverified, and the community accepted it as though it were settled science. 17 years, that unproven assumption redirected careers and research budgets, bending the entire trajectory of an emerging technology toward a dead end that was never actually proven to exist. Rosenblatt died at 43, leaving no printed rebuttal to the critique that had defined his reputation. The discipline that dismissed him never offered a major award in his lifetime. Died without knowing that machines would one day pass the medical licensing examination, compose legal briefs, and generate images through text, each one a direct descendant of a 400 photocell apparatus in a Buffalo laboratory. His prediction from 1958 arrived, roughly 60 years later, as engineering fact. He died in 1971, having never seen it vindicated. Took backpropagation, AlexNet, and a Nobel Prize in Physics to finally prove he had been right the entire time. This was the story of how long a correct idea could be buried. Frank Rosenblatt proposed that machines could learn from examples instead of following rules, built a working version in 1958, and watched his own field call it a dead end just 11 years later. That was this story here on Irata. And if you enjoy forgotten history told accuracy first, Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, and we will keep bringing the past back to light.